Orphaned black girl asks lonely CEO. Trade your gold for a family. He laughs, but then. The crystal chandelier casts dancing shadows across the marble floor of the grand ballroom as Manhattan's elite gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. Designer gowns swept past polished shoes, champagne glasses clinked in celebration, and the sound of forced laughter echoed through the opulent space. Yet in the center of it all, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, stood a man who had never felt more alone. Avery King adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years, as another board member approached with rehearsed congratulations about his latest acquisition. At 42, Avery had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents. King Industries was worth $4.7 billion, and his name appeared on Forbes' list every year without fail. His steel gray eyes, sharp jawline, and perfectly tailored Armani suit commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. But tonight, as he stood accepting praise for his generous $10 million donation to the charity, Avery felt the familiar hollow ache in his chest that no amount of success could fill. Mr. King, the foundation's director approached with a nervous smile. We're ready for your speech whenever you are. Avery nodded curtly and made his way to the podium. The crowd quieted as he gripped the microphone, his knuckles white against the silver stand. He looked out at the sea of faces, all of them eager to hear from the man who had everything. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the room with practiced authority. We gather tonight to celebrate hope. Hope for children who have none. Hope for futures that seem impossible. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. But I want to share something with you that might surprise you. The room grew still. Avery King never deviated from his prepared speeches. I stand before you tonight as living proof that success without connection is just another form of poverty. His voice cracked slightly, catching even himself off guard. I have accumulated more wealth than most could spend in 10 lifetimes. I have properties on 4 continents, a private jet, and more luxury than any one person needs. Yet I go home each night to an empty penthouse, eat dinner alone, and wake up to silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the typical corporate speech they'd expected. Money, Avery continued, his voice growing stronger, is a tool. But it's also a fortress. The higher you build it, the more it separates you from the very thing that makes life worth living, human connection. I've spent decades building walls of gold, only to discover I've trapped myself inside them. He set down his notes, speaking now from a place deeper than any script. I've betrayed and been betrayed. I've loved and lost. I've pushed away everyone who ever tried to get close because I believed that vulnerability was weakness. My parents taught me that emotions were luxuries we couldn't afford, that love was a distraction from success. And now, at the height of my achievements, I realize I've inherited their emptiness along with their empire. The silence in the room was deafening. Avery looked down at his hands, noticing for the first time how they trembled slightly. So yes, I donate to children's charities. I write checks that most people can't imagine. But I wonder sometimes if I'm trying to give these children what I never had, not just financial security, but the promise that someone, somewhere, actually cares about their well-being. He looked back up at the crowd, many of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to pity. Thank you for your time, and more importantly, thank you for your hearts. Something I'm still learning to use. As Avery stepped away from the podium, the applause was hesitant and confused. He had just publicly admitted to a room full of New York's most influential people that he was fundamentally broken. It was either the most honest thing he'd ever done, or the most foolish. Near the back of the room, behind the serving station where volunteers were arranging dessert plates, a young girl paused in her work. Jasmine Williams, 15 years old but wise beyond her years, had been listening to every word. Her dark eyes, bright with intelligence and understanding, tracked Avery's movements as he made his way through the crowd of uncomfortable well-wishers. Jasmine knew loneliness intimately. She'd been bounced between foster homes for most of her life, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting connections. But she'd learned to read people with an accuracy that often surprised adults. And right now, She was reading a man who had everything the world said mattered, yet possessed nothing that actually did. She watched as Avery excused himself from conversations, saw how his smile never quite reached his eyes, noticed how he maintained physical distance even when shaking hands. Here was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, and somehow, she understood exactly how that felt. The other volunteers were busy with their tasks, gossiping about the unexpected speech and wondering if the famous CEO was having some kind of breakdown. But Jasmine couldn't take her eyes off him. She recognized something in his bearing, in the way he held himself apart from everyone else. It was the same protective stance she'd perfected over years of being the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong anywhere. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Jasmine made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She smoothed her volunteer t-shirt, took a deep breath, and began walking toward the man who had just admitted to the world that he was as lost as she was. Avery King was about to discover that sometimes the most profound questions come from the most unexpected sources, and that the answer to a lifetime of loneliness might be standing right in front of him, wearing a name tag and carrying a wisdom that money could never buy. The marble floor clicked softly under Jasmine's sneakers as she approached the lonely titan, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had no idea that her next words would shatter everything Avery thought he knew about wealth, family, and the true meaning of home. Avery was loosening his tie when he noticed the girl approaching. Most people had given him a wide berth after his speech, unsure how to respond to such raw honesty from a man known for his calculated control. But this teenager walked straight toward him with the kind of confidence that couldn't be taught or bought. "Mr. King?" Jasmine's voice was soft but clear, cutting through the ambient chatter of the dwindling crowd. He turned, expecting another awkward condolence about his difficult evening, or perhaps a request for a selfie. Instead, he found himself looking into eyes that held a depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. They were eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, and somehow still held hope. "Yes?" He straightened his shoulders, automatically switching to his professional demeanor. "I heard your speech," she said, clasping her hands behind her back. "About being lonely despite having everything." Avery's jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was a teenager trying to counsel him about his personal revelations. "I'm sorry, but I should be. Would you trade your gold for a family?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Avery blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me? Your gold. Your money. Your empire." Jasmine's voice was steady, unafraid. "Would you trade all of it for a real family? People who actually care about you, not your bank account?" For a moment, Avery was speechless. Then, despite himself, he began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then grew into something louder, more manic. Several nearby guests turned to stare, but he couldn't stop. The absurdity of it all, a child in a volunteer t-shirt asking him to trade his life's work for something as intangible as love, struck him as both ridiculous and somehow profound. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, wiping his eyes. "You have no idea what you're talking about." His laughter carried a bitter edge. "Gold is what built my empire. Gold is what gives me power, influence, respect. A family?" He shook his head. "That's something I've never had and probably never will." Jasmine didn't flinch at his condescension. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him like a puzzle she was determined to solve. "So you'd rather have people fear you than love you?" "Fear is honest," Avery replied, his voice hardening. "Love is temporary. People leave. They die. They betray you. But gold? Gold is permanent. It's reliable. It's the only thing that has never let me down. But it hasn't made you happy," Jasmine observed quietly. The simplicity of her statement hit him like a physical blow. Avery's confident facade wavered for just a moment, long enough for her to see the wounded man beneath the armor of success. "Happiness is a luxury I can't afford," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Jasmine said, stepping closer. "Happiness is what you sacrifice to afford everything else." Avery stared at her, unnerved by her certainty. Who was this girl? What gave her the audacity to speak to him this way? More importantly, why did her words feel like they were carving truth into his bones? You don't understand, he said, his tone growing defensive. I've been betrayed by everyone who claimed to love me. My parents cared more about their reputation than their son. My ex-wife left me for someone who had more time for her than I did. My business partners have all tried to stab me in the back at one point or another. Gold doesn't lie. Gold doesn't leave. Gold doesn't break promises. But gold doesn't love you back either, Jasmine said softly. It doesn't hold your hand when you're scared. It doesn't laugh at your jokes or remember your birthday. It just sits there, cold and empty, like the life you're living. Avery felt his chest tighten. This girl, this stranger, was dismantling every justification he'd built for his isolation with the casual precision of someone who had lived through similar pain. And what would you know about it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What could a child possibly know about the complexities of adult relationships and business? Jasmine's expression grew sad but determined. I know what it's like to be alone. I know what it's like to have people who are supposed to care about you treat you like you're disposable. I know what it's like to build walls so high that nobody can hurt you, but also so high that nobody can reach you. Something in her tone made Avery's defensive anger crumble. He saw himself reflected in her words, in the way she held herself with practiced independence, in the careful way she spoke as if she'd learned early that words had power and consequence. I'm 15, she continued, and I've been in the system since I was 7. I've learned that most people will disappoint you. But I've also learned that some people won't. The difference is, you have to be brave enough to find out which is which. Avery found himself studying her face, searching for the cynicism he expected to find in someone who had clearly been through the foster system. Instead, he found something that both amazed and terrified him: hope. So I'll ask you again, Jasmine said, her voice gentle but unwavering. Would you trade your gold for a family? As she walked away, leaving him standing alone in the emptying ballroom, Avery realized that for the first time in decades, he didn't have an immediate answer. The question followed him to his car, rode with him through the silent streets of Manhattan, and would haunt him for days to come. Because somewhere in the depths of his carefully constructed fortress of success, a small voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the girl was right. 3 days had passed since the charity gala, and Avery hadn't slept more than a few hours each night. The girl's question echoed in his mind during board meetings, haunted him as he signed million-dollar contracts, and whispered to him in the silence of his penthouse. Would you trade your gold for a family? He stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered but never truly possessed. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who looked older than his 42 years, worn down by decades of emotional isolation. Sir? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Your cousin Marcus is here for the family meeting. Avery's stomach twisted. The quarterly King family gathering, a tradition his grandfather had established decades ago. What had once been intended as a way to keep the family close had become nothing more than a corporate strategy session disguised as a dinner party. Send him in, Avery said, straightening his tie. Marcus King entered with the same predatory smile that ran in their family bloodline. At 38, he was Avery's closest living relative and the one person who understood the cold mathematics of their inherited wealth. Cousin, Marcus said, embracing him with the kind of hollow affection that had been their family's trademark for generations. Ready for another thrilling evening of Uncle Theodore's battle stories and Aunt Helena's passive-aggressive comments about your bachelor status? Avery managed a weak smile. Can't wait. But as they drove to the family estate in the Hamptons, Avery found himself remembering things he'd spent years trying to forget. His childhood in this very house, where conversations at dinner consisted of stock prices and acquisition strategies. His father, Richard King, who had measured love in quarterly profits and showed affection through trust fund contributions. His mother, Catherine, who had been more concerned with social standing than her son's emotional well-being. The King mansion loomed before them, its Gothic architecture as imposing and cold as the people who lived there. Avery's hands trembled slightly as he walked through the front door, the familiar scent of expensive cologne and disappointment washing over him. "Avery!" Aunt Helena's voice cut through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. "There's my successful nephew. Though I have to say, your speech at that charity thing was rather dramatic, don't you think?" The family had gathered in the mahogany-paneled dining room, the same room where Avery had eaten countless silent dinners as a child. Uncle Theodore, his father's brother, sat at the head of the table with military precision. Cousin Jessica scrolled through her phone, more interested in her social media presence than family conversation. And there, in his father's old chair, sat the ghost of every king who had ever prioritized wealth over warmth. "So," Theodore began, cutting into his steak with surgical precision, "I trust that little emotional display at the gala won't affect any of our business relationships?" Avery felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "It was a moment of honesty, Uncle. Something this family could use more of." "Honesty?" Helena laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Darling, honesty is a luxury we can't afford. The king name represents stability, strength, control. Not vulnerability. Maybe that's the problem," Avery said quietly. The table fell silent. Jessica finally looked up from her phone, sensing drama. "What's gotten into you, Avery?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "You've been acting strange since the gala." "Strange." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Avery looked around the table at these people who shared his blood but not his heart, who knew his net worth but not his dreams, who had been present for every milestone but absent for every moment that mattered. "A girl asked me a question," he said finally. "She asked if I would trade my gold for a family." Theodore snorted. "A girl? What girl?" "A 15-year-old from the foster system. She's probably never had a real family in her life, and somehow she understood something that none of us do." "Which is?" Helena's voice dripped with condescension. "That this isn't a family. This is a board meeting with shared DNA." The silence that followed was deafening. Avery could see the shock, the anger, the discomfort rippling across their faces. But he also saw something else, recognition. They all knew he was right. "Our parents," Avery continued, his voice gaining strength, "raised us to believe that emotions were weaknesses, that love was a distraction from success. They taught us to measure worth in dollars and respect in fear. And look what it's created, a table full of people who share everything except the ability to actually care about each other." "That's enough," Theodore said, his voice hard as granite. But Avery wasn't finished. Years of suppressed pain came pouring out like water through a broken dam. "My father died surrounded by lawyers and accountants, not loved ones. My mother spent her last years in a mansion so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. And here we are, continuing the tradition of successful emptiness." He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That girl, Jasmine, she's been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love her, but she still believes in the possibility of family. We've never been abandoned by anyone because we've never let anyone close enough to leave." As Avery walked toward the door, he caught sight of his reflection in the antique mirror that had hung in the dining room for 3 generations. He saw his father's eyes, his grandfather's jawline, his great-grandfather's stern expression. He saw the weight of inherited loneliness pressing down on his shoulders like a crown he'd never asked to wear. "Where are you going?" Marcus called after him. "To find out what it means to be human," Avery replied without turning around. The drive back to the city was silent, but for the first time in days, Avery's mind was clear. He thought about Jasmine's question, about the wisdom in her young eyes, about the courage it took to ask someone to consider trading everything they thought they wanted for something they never believed they could have. Maybe it was time to find out if gold really was worth more than love. Maybe it was time to discover what he'd been missing all along. The next morning, Avery found himself doing something he'd never done before, using his resources to find someone not for business, but for understanding. Within hours, his private investigator had located Jasmine Williams at Riverside Group Home in Brooklyn. The file painted a picture of a girl who had been in the system for 8 years, bouncing between homes, yet somehow maintaining excellent grades and a spotless record. Avery stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly as he made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He needed to understand how someone so young could see through him so clearly. The group home was a far cry from the marble and mahogany of his world. It was a converted Victorian house with peeling paint and a small garden where a few teenagers sat on weathered benches. Avery felt out of place in his $1,000 suit, but when he asked to speak with Jasmine, the staff member who greeted him seemed more curious than suspicious. "She's in the back garden," the woman said. "Reading as usual." Avery found Jasmine sitting alone under an old oak tree, a worn paperback in her hands. She looked up as he approached, and he saw no surprise in her eyes, as if she'd been expecting him. "You came," she said simply, closing her book. "I couldn't stop thinking about your question," Avery admitted, sitting on the grass beside her bench. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That I was empty inside. That all my success meant nothing." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the cover of her book. "My caseworker says I'm too perceptive for my own good. I see things in people that they don't want others to see. And what do you see in me? A little boy who never got the love he needed, so he decided he didn't need it at all." Her voice was gentle but unflinching. "Someone who's been hurt so many times that he built walls to keep everyone out, but the walls became a prison." Avery felt his chest tighten. "You talk like you understand." "I do." Jasmine's voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone her age. "I've been rejected by more families than I can count. People who were supposed to love me, protect me, give me a home. They all found reasons to send me back." "I'm sorry," Avery said, and meant it. "Don't be. It taught me something important, that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to love someone even when it's difficult." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching other kids play in the distance. Finally, Avery spoke again. "Tell me about your mother. The investigator mentioned she died when you were 7. Jasmine's expression grew distant. "She was the most loving person I've ever known. She used to say that people were like books, you couldn't judge their worth by their covers, and the most beautiful stories were often found in the most unexpected places." "What did she do for work?" "She was a maid," Jasmine said with quiet pride. "She cleaned houses for wealthy families. She used to tell me stories about the places she worked, mansions with rooms bigger than our entire apartment, families who had everything but seemed to have nothing." Avery's heart began to race. "Do you remember any of the families she worked for?" "She worked for one family for almost 3 years. The Kings, I think. She always said they were the saddest people she'd ever met, especially the little boy." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Avery's mouth went dry as fragments of memory began to surface. A gentle woman with kind eyes who would hum while she cleaned, who would sometimes sneak him cookies when his parents weren't looking, who was the only person in his childhood home who ever asked him how he was feeling. "What was your mother's name?" he whispered. "Maria. Maria Santos. She died of cancer when I was 7. Said she didn't have insurance to fight it properly." The name hit Avery like a physical blow. Maria, the woman who had been more of a mother to him than his own mother ever was. The woman who had listened to his childish troubles, who had bandaged his scraped knees, who had been fired when his mother caught her, coddling him. "She was fired," Avery said, his voice barely audible. "My mother fired her because she said Maria was making me too soft." Jasmine's eyes widened. "You're him. You're the little boy she used to talk about." "She talked about me?" "All the time. She said you were the loneliest child she'd ever seen, that you needed love but were being taught to fear it. She used to cry after she lost that job, not because of the money, but because she worried about you." Tears Avery hadn't shed in decades began to fall. "I remember her. She was the only person in that house who ever hugged me, who ever told me I was good enough just as I was. She never forgot you," Jasmine said softly. Even at the end, she would tell me stories about the little boy who had everything but love, and how she hoped someone would eventually teach him that he deserved both. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was the daughter of the woman who had shown him the only genuine love of his childhood, a girl who had inherited her mother's wisdom and compassion despite, or perhaps because of, her own suffering. "Your mother," Avery said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved me in ways I didn't understand until now. And she died because my family's money couldn't reach her when she needed it most. She wouldn't want you to feel guilty," Jasmine said, her hand gently touching his arm. "She'd want you to honor her memory by learning to love and be loved." As they sat together in the fading afternoon light, Avery began to understand that this wasn't coincidence. This was fate, or destiny, or whatever force in the universe occasionally decides to give broken people a second chance at wholeness. "Jasmine," he said quietly, "what if I told you I wanted to try? To trade my gold for a family?" She smiled, and for the first time, Avery saw hope reflected back at him. "I'd say it's about time." The weeks that followed their reunion were unlike anything Avery had ever experienced. He found himself making trips to Brooklyn that had nothing to do with business deals or profit margins. Instead, he would sit with Jasmine in the group home's small library, listening to her talk about her dreams of becoming a teacher, watching her help younger kids with their homework, and slowly learning what it meant to care about someone else's happiness more than his own success. But the more time he spent with Jasmine, the more the weight of his inherited wealth pressed down on him like a guilty conscience. Every night, he would return to his penthouse and stare at the city lights, thinking about Maria Santos, a woman who had died because she couldn't afford the medical care that he spent more than on a single business lunch. "I can't keep living like this," he said to himself one evening, standing in his home office surrounded by awards and accolades that suddenly felt meaningless. The next morning, Avery called an emergency board meeting. His senior executives filed into the conference room with their usual mix of confidence and ambition, but they quickly sensed that something fundamental had shifted in their CEO. "I'm implementing immediate changes to our corporate structure," Avery announced without preamble. "We're establishing the Maria Santos Foundation with an initial funding of $500 million. It will provide free healthcare, education, and family support services for underprivileged communities." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. James Hartford, his CFO, looked pale. "Avery, that's a significant portion of our liquid assets. The shareholders will adapt," Avery said firmly. "We're also restructuring our employee compensation. Everyone from janitors to junior executives will receive a living wage and comprehensive benefits." "Sir?" another executive interjected. "With respect, these changes could impact our quarterly projections." "Good," Avery said, his voice cutting through their protests. "I've spent my entire career maximizing profits while minimizing human value. That ends now." But the most difficult conversation was yet to come. That evening, Avery met with his lawyers to begin the process that would change his life forever. "I want to petition for guardianship of Jasmine Williams," he told his attorney, Rebecca Chin, who had handled his family's legal affairs for years. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. "Avery, that's a significant decision. Are you certain you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied. "I want to give her the family she deserves, and I want to learn how to be the man her mother believed I could become." The legal process was lengthy and thorough. Social workers interviewed both Avery and Jasmine extensively, examining his motivations and her feelings about the potential arrangement. There were background checks, home visits, and psychological evaluations that forced Avery to confront decades of emotional suppression. During one particularly intense session with the court-appointed therapist, Avery found himself breaking down completely. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to love someone without conditions, without expecting something in return. What if I fail her the way my parents failed me?" "The fact that you're asking that question," the therapist said gently, "suggests you're already different from your parents." Meanwhile, Avery began reaching out to estranged family members, not to include them in business decisions, but to offer something he'd never given before: genuine reconciliation. He called his cousin Marcus, surprising him with an invitation that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. "I want to have dinner," Avery said. "Just dinner. No business talk, no family drama. I want to know how you're doing, what makes you happy, what keeps you up at night." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Are you feeling okay, Avery?" "I'm feeling human for the first time in decades," he replied. The dinner was awkward at first, both men struggling to navigate a conversation without the familiar structure of corporate strategy. But slowly, tentatively, they began to share stories from their childhood, memories of their grandparents, dreams they'd abandoned in pursuit of success. "I've missed this," Marcus admitted as the evening wound down. "I've missed having a cousin instead of just a business partner." "So have I," Avery said, meaning it. 3 months after their first conversation in the group home garden, Avery received the call that would change everything. The court had approved his petition for guardianship. Jasmine Williams would officially become his responsibility, his family, his daughter in every way that mattered. When he picked her up from the group home for the last time, Jasmine carried only a small duffel bag containing her few possessions. But her smile was brighter than all the gold in his treasury. "Ready to go home?" Avery asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been ready my whole life," she replied, taking his hand. As they drove through the city toward his penthouse, which he was already planning to trade for something warmer, more welcoming, Avery realized that he was finally beginning to understand his mother Maria's greatest lesson: that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, sold, or inherited. They could only be chosen, nurtured, and shared. The transformation was far from complete, but for the first time in his life, Avery King was trading his gold for something infinitely more precious. He was choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, family over fortune. And in Jasmine's eyes, he could see Maria Santos smiling, knowing that her little boy had finally found his way home. 6 months later, Avery stood in the kitchen of their new home, a warm, welcoming brownstone in Brooklyn, just a few miles from where Jasmine had grown up. Gone was the cold marble and sterile perfection of his penthouse. In its place were family photos, Jasmine's artwork on the refrigerator, and the comfortable chaos that comes with actually living in a space rather than simply occupying it. "Dad, you're burning the pancakes again," Jasmine called from the breakfast table, not looking up from her homework. The word, "Dad," still sent a jolt of joy through Avery's chest every time he heard it. He flipped the pancakes, slightly charred, but made with love, and smiled at how natural the morning routine had become. Who would have thought that the CEO who once closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast would find such satisfaction in making sure a teenager had a proper meal before school? "Sorry," he said, sliding the pancakes onto her plate. "I'm still learning." "You're getting better," Jasmine assured him with a grin. "Remember the first week when you tried to make scrambled eggs in the microwave?" Avery laughed, a sound that came so easily now it amazed him. The man who had once measured every expression, calculated every emotion, now found himself laughing multiple times a day, at Jasmine's jokes, at his own domestic failures, at the simple absurdity of how much his life had changed. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Family barbecue this Sunday? Real family time, not business." The King family gatherings had transformed too. What had once been cold corporate affairs had slowly evolved into something resembling actual family time. It hadn't been easy, decades of emotional distance don't disappear overnight, but the effort was genuine, and that made all the difference. "Uncle Marcus wants to know if we're coming to the barbecue on Sunday," Avery said, showing Jasmine the text. "Will Aunt Helena still ask me about my college prospects and career trajectory?" Jasmine asked with mock seriousness. "Probably. But she also asked me to bring your famous chocolate chip cookies, so I think she's warming up to you." "She's warming up to my cookies," Jasmine corrected. "But it's a start." After Jasmine left for school, Avery made his way to his new office, still successful, still profitable, but now driven by purpose rather than greed. The Maria Santos Foundation had already helped over 10,000 families access healthcare and education. King Industries still thrived, but now it thrived while making the world better rather than just making money. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. King? There's a young man here to see you. Says he's from the Riverside Group home?" Avery looked up to see a nervous-looking 17-year-old standing in his doorway, clutching a folder of papers. "I'm David," the boy said. "Jasmine said you might. I mean, she thought maybe you could help me. I age out of the system next month, and I don't have anywhere to go." Looking at David, Avery saw himself at 17, scared, alone, building walls to protect a heart that was breaking. But he also saw something else, an opportunity to extend the circle of love that Maria had started, that Jasmine had rekindled, and that he was now learning to share. "Sit down, David," Avery said gently. "Let's talk." That evening, as the sun set over Brooklyn, Avery and Jasmine sat on their front porch swing, another addition he never would have imagined wanting. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of families ending their day, children playing, parents calling them in for dinner, the comfortable hum of community. "You know what I realized today?" Jasmine said, curled up next to him with a book in her lap. "What's that?" "You did it. You actually traded your gold for a family." Avery considered this. "Not all of it. We still have more money than we need. But you're using it differently now. You're sharing it. Mom always said that gold was only valuable when it helped people, not when it just sat in a vault. Your mother was very wise. She would have loved seeing you like this," Jasmine said softly. "Happy. Really happy." Avery pulled her closer, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. A year ago, he couldn't remember the last time he touched another human being with genuine affection. Now, these moments of connection were the highlights of his day. "I have something to tell you," he said. "I've been thinking about David, and kids like him. What would you think about turning this into something bigger? Maybe opening our home to other kids who need families?" Jasmine's eyes lit up. "You mean like foster care?" "Not exactly. I mean like family. Real family. The kind your mother believed everyone deserved." As they sat together, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Avery realized that Jasmine's question at the charity gala hadn't been about trading gold for family at all. It had been about understanding that love multiplies when it's shared, that true wealth isn't diminished when it's given away, and that the best investments are the ones that grow hearts instead of bank accounts. "Thank you," he whispered to the stars, knowing that somewhere, Maria Santos was smiling. He had found his treasure at last, and it was worth more than all the gold in the world.